When it comes to female brain dynamics, a helpful illustration to keep in mind is imagine any scenario where a woman enters a male-dominated space. You'll notice every man begins to police his language, he begins to moderate his conduct, and everyone will start to compete for her attention. Before long, an environment that was once deeply rooted in objective analysis or abstraction analysis very subtly shifts toward caution, toward risk aversion, and into a state of social harmony. When you discuss philosophy, for instance, nobody will ever fully confront the uncomfortable truths or the logical conclusions of their ideas, all for fear of disrupting group consensus. And that's all because truth, as consensus, delivers a feeling of belonging. It's a dopamine hit. If your beliefs are repeatedly affirmed, well, that just amounts to repeated injections of emotional catharsis. Synthetic Man had a take on this, and what he thinks that happens is that some new users court the chuds with some base takes, and then what happens is they build their channel from there on up. But the way I see it, this has been a long-running phenomenon. It's driven a lot of the content for older anti-SJW folks in the past. The way it goes is base takes will just say these are male brain takes. Try to take course, because the female brain domain has become too comfortable and too complacent. Nothing's working, so the cycle follows Dave Green's dialectic where the current order needs to shift because people become restless. The status quo isn't working. So here's what I think is going on. You get a new YouTube channel that pops up and you're recommended and you start watching him or her. But whatever the case may be, this user has the answer to the current problem, and he attempts to solve it through a style that is unapologetic or edgy, as the saying goes. Maybe he employs some objective or abstract analysis that is interesting. Maybe it's philosophically compelling. And that's where my aforementioned analogy comes in. As soon as this chud's audience becomes essentially too big to fail and sunk cost is set in, well, the chud starts softening his approach. It's like when a female comes into a male-dominated space. Everyone goes wacko. So maybe this chud starts to reveal that it was all a LARP or that he was just joking. But of course he says this all under the table or within a venue that gives him plausible deniability. And that's what I propose is what drives palatable dissent, or managed dissent. And now let's talk about palatable dissent, or as the case may be, palatable dissidence. Now there's a number of channels who fit under this category. I'll just name a few. There's The Critical Drinker, there's Nerdrotic, there's Mauler, Geeks and Gamers, Heel vs. Babyface, and they all fit under a very nice, comfortable umbrella. If you view them against society at large, it would be tempting to locate much of their content somewhere in the middle of the female brain dialectic, and that would suggest that their voices are courting genuine debate and eventual conciliation, right? In practice, however, no conciliation ever materializes, and that's the point. Any actual dissidents, like Synthetic Man for instance, but any chud could fall into this category, is routinely shunned by these people. They are specifically blacklisted from these communities. And I would propose that reinforces the idea that many of these people are actually statists. They're not just centrist libertarians, and they all operate entirely within female brain-dominated spaces. Now, they all share deep structural similarities that go farther than overlapping audiences and cultural context. You'll notice platforms like X or YouTube purposely guide you to these particular channels or to these particular influencers, personalities, and are you ever asking yourself why? Or are you just accepting it like a good golem? Now, as we know, YouTube does corral people based on what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say, and you're also incentivized to chase trending topics, because there's algorithmic incentives involved with that. But who gets to decide what topics will quietly shape what can be said and how far dissent can go? And to what extent are these forces at work across nearly every major platform online? Think of Reddit's subreddit rules and their moderator culture. Think of X's fluctuating enforcement, and think of various Discord server norms. Everybody has guardrails attached to their platforms, and these all guide conversations toward particular conclusions, all the while punishing any speech that ventures too far outside an accepted frame. So if we get back to palatable dissent, you're told this is organic criticism, when in reality, it's often very carefully bounded dissent. Intentionally or otherwise, these influencers are courting a female-brained architecture, which is throughout the internet. That's why the word palatable is precisely fitting. Palatable indicates that even though their content may lack any real intellectual bite or savory quality, it still functions at least as comfort food for any dissidents who wish to abstain from any serious commitment to the logical conclusions or philosophical implications of their own ideas. So here's a brief survey as to what these channels do. They're video essays, people do reviews, they have group discussion streams, and it's all focused primarily on pop culture. Most of what they talk about is the decline of narrative quality in mainstream entertainment, mostly due to the intrusion of political messaging. A lot of these channels gained significant traction in the 2018-2022 window. Their growth was fueled by the culture war peaks around Disney's Star Wars sequels and the broader anti-woke backlash against films like Captain Marvel. Much of their popularity also aligned with the COVID lockdowns of 2020 through 2021, which acted as a massive tailwind for YouTube consumption overall. While many of these creators had already been building audiences during the 2017 through 2019 Star Wars and Marvel backlash, with The Last Jedi serving as a major catalyst, the lockdowns provided the extra surge that drove explosive gains in subscribers and views. So we have a sunk cost fallacy going on here as well. What was once a simmering dissatisfaction with mainstream media became a full-blown audience gold rush for channels who were willing to voice their dissent. But the problem is it's all a LARP. In general, while they do talk about problems in media and in pop culture, they do so with an ironic, detached tone that evades full commitment to any actual dissent. Their audience broadening also favors liberal voices and only moderately conservative ones. And if they are ever confronted by any of their edgier male-brain takes, well, they'll say they're just joking. It's just a meme, bro. Which gratifies the same death cult escapism, the don't take it so seriously ethos of Redditors, and is exemplified by millennial writing, like that Joss Whedon-style quippy humor, which is also something they criticize, by the way. It's funny to note that the Critical Drinker, even in his most recent review of the Supergirl movie, criticized the film for being safe edgy, when his channel exists on one of the most safe edgy platforms on the internet. Now, many of these channels routinely deploy a convenient rhetorical safety net, a vague, all-purpose invocation of the writing. It serves as a polite way to signal your distaste with something without venturing into more pointed territory. Additionally, you'll often hear the word objective tossed in for good measure, as though labeling your critique objective somehow elevates its quality beyond being preference-based or renders your standards any less arbitrary. But ultimately, what many of these channels have done over the past few years is establish and reinforce this strange limbo where everyone is intentionally kept at the cusp of naming what exactly the problem is with pop culture, with modern entertainment. But they never cross that line because doing so would break some unwritten taboo. Think of a court jester in a medieval kingdom. He's allowed to mock the king and the court, but only within carefully prescribed limits. In the end, it entertains the courtiers, it relieves tension, but ultimately it all reinforces the status quo rather than threatening anything. So ultimately what you have here are content creators who have found a comfortable sweet spot of criticizing media without risking any deplatforming. In the past, I've referred to people like this as controlled opposition, but to be clear, that doesn't imply literal marching orders from politicians or corporations, although that is not without the realm of possibility. Rather, these figures are statists at heart. Now, I've heard many within the Chud sphere refer to them as centrist libertarians. I've done that as well, but I believe even that label is too generous because it assumes that they actually believe in anything at all. No, in reality, we should call these people statists. And they are statists insofar as their default assumptions about the world, about truth, will generally align with the prevailing progressive managerial hierarchy of our time. The reason they do this is because it allows them to dominate online status games, posing as the responsible pursuit of wisdom and knowledge. In other words, they pose as male-brained influencers, and that's how they draw you into their community. But as soon as you start to think for yourself, as soon as you start to use those same male-brain patterns to recognize other patterns, well, that same community will start to anathematize you, regardless as to your ability to do exactly what they do, to do the same kind of deep thunk, objective, or abstract analysis. So in practice, statism manifests as an ingrained bias that treats mainstream media creators and institutions as essentially apolitical. So that means when it comes to talking about Rian Johnson, for instance, or Kathleen Kennedy, or Joss Whedon, James Gunn, Hideo Kojima, any other director, producer, executive, etc., etc., a statist must necessarily adopt a mode of analysis that is detached from the ideological forces that actually shape media output. In other words, this is how these people think. They've convinced themselves that because they're fans of a franchise, that means all the people involved in the corporation that delivers them the product must be on their side, and any deviation from what media should be isn't a direct attack on culture. It's just an unfortunate oopsie. It was just badly written because the writers just didn't know how to write well. They didn't use the right tropes, or they didn't use the right methodologies. And by the way, this is also what drives and has driven a lot of console war stuff. When people engage in console wars, they think of themselves as having aligned with the corporations and therefore having gained some unearned status as a result. And they don't view these corporations as having turned them into golem consumers and have zero personal investment in them as people. They're just lowly peons whose 9 to 5 exists solely as a means of making money to buy their next product. Now this will help you understand why a statist will frequently frame his approach as objective, because in the statist's mind, he's just addressing the status quo as a neutral given and not a set of adversarial ideological circumstances. Consequently, statists rarely, if ever, examine the ethnicities, the backgrounds, or networks of writers, directors, producers, and others, because to do so would violate a post-civil rights era consensus that they instinctively uphold. It's been programmed into us. It's this need to be anti-discriminatory and regard such scrutiny as bigoted and therefore anathema. But here I would like to briefly allude to a video made by the channel Kane's Games. And Kane recently made an hour-long video talking about Amazon's The Boys series. And one of the first things he says is this.
After the first season, one of the lead writers left the show, and that lead writer happened to have been Vince Gilligan, one of the head writers from Breaking Bad. You know that show that was almost universally praised, and to this day people still talk about? And apparently the reason he left was because of conflicts with Eric Kripke. He's Jewish, by the way, remember that. And after season 1, Eric Kripke decided to stop smoking the foreskin pipe long enough to start getting his greasy hands on the show's writing, and instead turned the show into his own therapy session where he could bitch and cry about right-wing politics and the big orange wall kisser himself by turning Homelander into an allegory for Trump. And of course, because of that, the quality of the show suffered tremendously.
Now, if you're a chud and you enjoy content from, say, Synthetic Man, from Kane's Games, from Latina Parfait, from Dead Internet Despot, from Trides, from Deranged Doomer, the byline that is consistent to all these channels is a little thing we like to call pattern recognition. Now, for the aforementioned statists, or centrist libertarians, those who pride themselves on objective analysis, why do these channels always keep their analyses on the surface level? Isn't pattern recognition key to objective analysis? And for those who need a rundown on what I mean, if media is the way it is, and if you keep telling your audience things like it's just the writing, you basically narrow things down to a coin flip, which isn't helpful at all. It basically turns media consumption into a zero-sum game, rather than look at anything underlying it. And this means that more and more bad media just gets churned out on a regular basis, because they know you're going to consume it. Now recently I posted a video explaining my theory on why most long-form content exists. Language, or more appropriately speech, has become so constricted that we've all been forced to find thousands and thousands of words to explain very simple things. Because we know that using other words, more helpful words, more descriptive words, means we've suddenly become bigoted. But as you just saw from Kane here, he immediately cuts to the quick. That happened about 3 minutes into his video on the boys. And after hearing that, we immediately know what the problem is. We can name it. But again, one of the chief reasons a statist or a centrist lib won't do this is out of the fear of being labeled racist. Closely related is the very real fear of being deplatformed or experiencing any other professional repercussions. But the irony of that is made evident in the media itself as a product that is being consumed by these people. Star Wars, Marvel, DC, etc. cape shit. The genre revolves around heroes who stand up against evil, often at great personal cost. A lot of these creators will spend minutes to hours psychoanalyzing a character like Thanos, a fictional character. But when it comes to analyzing media rife with problems in its writing, they don't go into the early life history or education of the people who made it. They don't try to figure out whether or not the problem is deeper than the surface. Why are the bad guys almost always stand-ins for Nazis, for Trump supporters, or any other generic right-wing caricature? Who could benefit from framing Dissent this way? What kinds of people are most inclined to repeatedly inject this specific brand of social commentary into entertainment, even after fans have made their displeasure with it abundantly clear for years? The primary reason that Mahler's channel has become as popular as it is today has next to nothing to do with his commentary. It's more a testament to whom or what he was perceived as standing against. For his analysis of Star Wars: The Last Jedi, he very specifically addressed Rian Johnson by name, in addition to various actors involved with the film. And so he appeared as if he was pulling back the veil on some of this stuff, and although he wasn't making clear sense through his commentary about the ideology behind it all, he was at least making his audience aware of what was being said behind the scenes. What's noteworthy is how effective this was in his earlier content. Take for example his talking about the video game Ukulele, a video series which I personally consider to be his best analysis, if only because much of the video involved using other people's words against them.
They announced they're using the Unity engine, which is the engine you make the fucking Donald Trump game with.
Yes, Donkey, because it is free. You know what else was made using Unity? A little game known only as, Hollow Knight. No, it doesn't seem like much of a shock considering the others I've mentioned, that another gorgeous and fantastically tight game like Hollow Knight was created on Unity. Donkey probably didn't know. It's not like he's played Hollow Knight.
Hollow Knight, which has raised the bar for Metroidvanias to infinity. I mean, you just gotta feel bad for anyone trying to follow this shit up. Good luck. For real, good luck.
Well, that's just fucking embarrassing. Anyway, it was made clear in fucking 2012 that Playtonic were highly interested in Unity. So implying that it was some sort of bait and switch, cop-out move is literally just dishonest.
But anyway, back in the day, Mahler's analyses also brought the ire of arrogant breadtubers like H. Bomber Guy unfolding ideas down upon him. And regardless to Mahler's apolitical insistences, any perceived pushback against progressive media, and The Last Jedi most certainly is progressive media, would inevitably paint him as far-right and reinforcing dissident beliefs. Now, the YouTube channel Lacking Saint offered a substantive takedown of Mahler's claims of objectivity, as well as Mahler's occasional arrogance. Unfortunately for Jack, he undermined his own position by partnering with this person. And I'm just going to show you a picture of this person. When you see this picture, you'll instantly realize what Jack was attempting to do and why it was so dishonest. Now, in a potential debate, Jack could have presented the most airtight counter-argument as one could in response to Mahler or EFAP about any given subject matter about movies, but that's not the point. The point is, what Jack was doing was a form of leftist, performative, moral grandstanding. It's something every breadtuber does in order to tip the scales in their favor, and they continue to do this because the only thing they know to do is to find the nearest person who they can use to promulgate the oppressed identity category and win through status, rather than objective analysis. And again, it's ironic because Jack could have won through objective analysis. He was actually pretty good at it. But anyway, Mahler's decision to opt out of a potential debate with Jack Saint was a shrewd one. To that point, Mahler gained popularity because he played the status and group consensus game, which is the game you need to play on the internet in order to win. What people need to be aware of is that these centrist libertarian types can oppose fringe progressive meddling in media, which lends to the appearance that they're based and they reject progressivism outright. But their crusade only stops insofar as they must reduce true believers into becoming useful idiots once again. And yes, that includes both sides of the spectrum. And I think this again leans into the irony of how modern media works. Going back to the Thanos example, I remember when it was hyped to just psychoanalyze Thanos or some other Marvel villain to see how intricate a villain could be. And that's funny to consider in a field of critics who have forced themselves to speak in bare minimum generalities when it comes to their own media, and not to simply ask the question if a fictional world's interpretation of good and evil reflects any actual lived experience. So if you're a fellow chud, you realize this is the main difference between an all-out leftist and one of those centrist libertarian types. A leftist will tell you what he believes in, whereas a centrist lib tells you he doesn't believe in anything except that nobody should believe in anything. So they're nihilists. They have no other mode other than to say they don't commit to anything except that they believe nobody else should interfere with their non-commitment. And again, the irony to that is much of the modern media that they consume and they dislike reflects that exact state of studied non-commitment, carefully sidestepping any hard truths or sincerity. Mahler and EFAP have routinely platformed left-leaning guests, all the while they blacklist figures like Synthetic Man. Ask yourself, where do their true leanings lie? They may insist it's all about objective analysis, right? But in reality, it's all about truth as consensus. It's about finding other high-status people on the internet and are very often moderate or leftists or who have shown themselves to be a good golem, and thereby they extend their influence. And that context is crucial for understanding his 2022 attacks on Synthetic Man. I mean, he even admitted he was being dishonest, and his regular viewers aren't ever going to pause and unsubscribe because Mr. Objective Analysis has had a moment of inconsistency. The hug box is all that matters to these people. At the root of the conflict between EFAP and Synthetic Man is not a difference of opinion. You need to understand that. It's not even a political difference. Instead, it's because, time and again, Synthetic Man has demonstrated he isn't interested in playing status games, or catering to an underlying truth as consensus that so many of these other channels play and sustain themselves upon. That's why he was blacklisted. And for anyone who is deeply invested in Mahler or EFAP, consider this. In the past, these creators had lambasted a massive multimedia conglomerate for mishandling their beloved franchise, Star Wars. All the while, they turned around and uncritically praised a subsidiary of that same conglomerate, Marvel, all as if the prior failures from Star Wars never occurred. And they repeat that pattern constantly, by the way. Why is that? Well, you need to look at these people as statists. They specifically avoid talking about politics, which limits their criticism to operating within this strange liminal zone that treats good or bad media as just random hits or misses, with little acknowledgement of any underlying motivations regarding any of it. And the reason they avoid addressing those motivations is that, one, they would need to understand those motivations, but two, in the mind of a statist, the people or institutions who are necessary in shaping and propagating mainstream media must be removed from any ordinary accountability or scrutiny. It's essentially some glorified form of leave the multi-million-dollar corporation alone. But even looking at that realistically, for a lot of people, Star Wars, Marvel, and Disney in general propagate entire religions. Religion in this sense being an area of profound devotion or obligation. And as such, these franchises are seen as above reproach, as are the people who make them. You can include corporations like Nintendo, like Microsoft, and Sony in this dynamic, which also might explain why Sony would have been seen as above reproach by Mahler and EFAP, and why they had to rebuke Synthetic Man for trashing their newest Goyslop God of War movie game. To be absolutely clear, Mahler and EFAP are high-functioning golems. The entire reason their channels exist is to curry managed dissent for trending consumer products, all the while their rhetoric unconsciously defaults to upholding group consensus. In other words, the taken-for-granted blend of corporate-state fusion, cultural managerialism, and progressive assumptions that dominate liberal institutions. It is the default operating system of elite media, of academia, and entertainment that most centrists treat as neutral or common sense, and they don't see it as any specific ideological regime. Now, this is something that the YouTube channel Spree Snooter also highlighted in The Critical Drinker. For instance, how the critical drinker treats the strong woman archetype in modern media as an unquestioned given, and the only real critique is whether it was well written.
Incorporating progressive themes and ideas into entertainment is no different than incorporating traditional conservative themes and ideas. They're both just perspectives that the audience is invited to consider.
People like this running the largest right-wing media channels is the reason why the right never wins culturally. It's the reason why modern-day conservatives are further left than Obama-era Democrats. They don't mind the blatantly subversive anti-white propaganda so long as it's done well. But, Drinker can totally be trusted when it comes to talking about the message.
Not only does Critical Drinker's approach keep all his criticism at a surface level, it fundamentally presumes that all mainstream media operates in good faith. Consequently, any bad writing becomes nothing more than an unfortunate oopsie. It's not a pattern of behavior indicative of people of a particular ideology or ethnic identity. No, I won't talk about that. But to stay on point about female brain dynamics, when it comes to the Critical Drinker's takes, just take a mental note of how agreeable he is and how often he defers to whatever the prevailing opinion is whenever he's in a group setting. Like how he deferred to Mahler when Mahler said the Fallout show was bad. But I won't go into much detail about the Critical Drinker here, because not only have I covered his inconsistencies in the past, but the YouTube channel Spree Snooter has already covered that front in his video 1348 Ex Voto and the Lie of Female Equality. Suffice it to say, I will grant that the engagement offered by Mahler and similar channels represents a shift that some male-brained ideas are coming out of the exclusion stage of the female-brain dialectic into a form of isolation. But the problem is those ideas are kind of stuck there, forever echoing each other within their localized echo chambers. And the question is, how long can they maintain that? Well, that's when you'll see a selective harvesting of base takes from actual dissidents, people who are not so popular. And so what future channels will do is they will attempt to introduce taboo ideas that may have already been presented by chuds, maybe like Synthetic Man, or Kane's Games, or Latina Parfait, or Dead Internet Despot, but these takes will be watered down and sanitized, of course, until they can become fully part of managed dissent, palatable dissent. And that's something I will talk more about in my next video. But this is what people need to recognize when we talk about grift. Grifters are basically idea thieves, because the only ideas worth implementing in society right now, and will fix many problems we're experiencing right now, are ideas that have been generated by the right. So what grifters will do, if they're good at it, is that they will wait until taboo ideas have been sufficiently stress-tested and partially normalized before they talk about them openly. That will reach the invasion and subversion stages of the female brain dialectic. And so normie audiences will be able to feed on those ideas as novelty takes, even though the chuds have been talking about those ideas for years. And all the while, these grifters protect their own status and their own audience cohesion. And they don't need to believe in a single thing that they talk about. The last thing I want to say here is that if you look at Mahler, EFAP, or any of these other palatable dissident channels, there is no desire to improve the state of media. And that's not because the entire point of these channels is repeated affirmation bias for dopamine hits, although that is part of it. But when you have people who are taught to think like women, and they continue to perpetuate these female brain spaces on the internet, well then problem-solution analysis just never really registers at all. And at that point, it really is like arguing with your wife or your girlfriend. It's not about resolving legitimate conflict so much as she just wants you to listen to her prattle on for a few moments, all for the sake of affirmation and moral approval.